Hi, everyone. Welcome to the panel. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our panel on modern authoritarianism and new challenges to democracy. So welcome. Thanks so much for spending part of your day with us. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, where we're going to talk about new research that's come out on authoritarian regimes and democratization. And we're going to have our conversation centered today around three books that just came out. I have them in front of me. My name is Annie Meng. I'm an assistant professor of politics at UVA. My research focuses on authoritarian regimes and institutions and elite power sharing. And my book that just came out last year is Constraining Dictatorship, from Personalized Rule to Institutionalized Regimes. It was published with Cambridge University Press. I have two awesome panelists with me today. I'm so excited that you could both join me. We have Dr. Elizabeth Nugent and Dr. Bryn Rosenfeld. So Dr. Nugent is an assistant professor at Yale. Her research focuses on authoritarianism, political psychology, and the Middle East. And her book that also just came out last year is After Repression, How Polarization Derails Democratic Transition. And it was published with Princeton University Press. And Dr. Rosenfeld is an assistant professor of government at Cornell. Dr. Rosenfeld focuses on political behavior, development and democratization, protest and post-communist politics. And her book just came out this year, a few months ago, and it's called The Autocratic Middle Class: How State Dependency Reduces the Demand for Democracy. And it was published with Princeton University Press. So Liz and Bryn, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, would have been better to be in person, but it's nice to see you both.
I was just saying, once we can get together in person, we'll throw a huge book party. But for today, I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So just to kind of give everyone a sense of what we're going to do for the next hour, I'm going to have the three of us each take about 5 minutes just to kind of summarize the main puzzle and the main findings and kind of big ideas of each of our books. And then after that, we're just going to kind of open it up and have a very open-ended discussion about where we think the kind of cutting edge of research on these topics currently is, where we think the research kind of is going next. And we'll kind of think about policy implications of our work. And we're also going to open it up and take questions from the audience. So for our wonderful audience, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to send us questions basically for the next hour. We are really looking forward to your questions, and we're looking forward to kind of engaging back and forth with our audience. So I think what I'm going to have us do is the order in which I'll have us discuss our books. Let's go from kind of most autocratic to least autocratic / the kind of democratization spectrum. So that means I will go first, and then Bryn will go second, and then Liz will go third. Awesome. So my book, Constraining Dictatorship, basically it talks about how the kind of modern dictatorship looks today. So before I summarize the kind of main features of my book, let me actually just take a step back and let me kind of set the stage in terms of thinking about what we currently know on authoritarian regimes. So the one really important kind of thing to note in terms of kind of background is that the typical authoritarian regime today does not look like North Korea, right? The typical authoritarian regime today actually has the whole host of nominally democratic institutions. So things like parties, including opposition parties. So they have ruling parties and opposition parties. They hold elections. They have legislatures that meet on a regular basis. They have courts. They have constitutions. Basically, the kind of modern day authoritarian regime has actually become a lot similar to democracies. And this is partly because in the post-Cold War world, dictators have just gotten really smart about appearing democratic, right? However, an important thing to note is that a lot of these nominally democratic institutions are actually very weak. So things like parties and legislatures kind of appear strong, but are often quite weak in practice. So for instance, the kind of average ruling party doesn't tend to outlive the death or departure of its founding leader, right? So for instance, the ruling party, the NPR in the Democratic Republic of Congo under Mobutu didn't survive in power past the departure of the leader. The same thing happened with the ruling PDG party in Guinea, which was banned immediately following the death of the leader, Sékou Touré. Similarly, a lot of legislatures and autocracies kind of appear to meet on a regular basis, but are very much controlled by the leader. So, given that that's kind of the current setting of modern authoritarian regimes, this is where my book kind of comes in. So the kind of first thing that my book emphasizes is that we need to understand not just why institutions exist, because for the most part, most regimes have all of these institutions. What I really stress is that we need to understand why there is variation in the strength and levels of institutionalization of autocratic institutions, right? So separating out weak versus strong institutions and really trying to understand how kind of rules and procedures and institutions can really shape power in a very meaningful way. So the second kind of place where my book comes in is that surprisingly, we actually don't have a ton of studies looking directly at presidential power in dictatorships. There's been a lot of research looking at these kind of pseudo-democratic institutions, parties, legislatures, elections that are kind of in the periphery of the regime executive. But what I do is I just look directly at the regime executive itself, right? What are the types of rules that really structure and limit presidential power in dictatorships? So I'm interested in the kind of rules that really regulate the peak of power, the executive branch in these dictatorships. So the central question that my book looks at is how do we explain how executive power becomes institutionalized in dictatorships? So in other words, how do these autocratic regimes go from being a kind of personalist dictatorship that's controlled by just kind of one single guy in power to becoming an institutionalized regime that's governed by rules and procedures and structures that can survive multiple transitions of power? So the types of institutions that I focus on, as I mentioned before, are executive constraints. So things that really shape power at the very highest peaks of the regime. Specifically, the two types of executive constraints that I collect data on in my book are constitutional rules that shape executive power and appointments to key cabinet positions. So specifically, the two types of constitutional rules that I look at are term limits, as well as kind of formal succession procedures within the Constitution. So the typical succession procedure in an autocratic constitution basically lays out the procedures for what happens if the leader were to die or become incapacitated. So for instance, a typical constitutional rule will say, in the event of the leader's death, it is the vice president who becomes the de facto successor. This is a really important way to shape kind of limits on presidential power because it basically denotes a number two person in the regime, right? The Constitution kind of explicitly lays out who would replace the leader in the case the leader's death or departure. Another thing that I look at is I look at appointments to key cabinet positions. So things like, is there a vice president appointed and is there a defense minister appointed? I also look at the rates at which people in these key positions are kind of rotated or whether one person is allowed to kind of have this position for long periods of time. So the kind of willingness of an autocratic leader to share power with elites for these high cabinet positions is not just a trivial handout, right? In a lot of autocratic regimes, leaders actually strategically will leave these posts vacant, or even in kind of extreme cases, sometimes they'll actually appoint themselves as their own vice president, right? So whether a leader is willing to kind of appoint another elite to these key positions is a really powerful indicator as to whether there's kind of, levels of elite power sharing and whether the regime is effectively governed through collective rule. I have two major findings in my book. And the first is that what really gives institutions bite is whether these power sharing mechanisms are shifting power and empowering other elites. So it's not just about rules that exist on paper. It's about whether elites are actually given resources of the state in order to build their own coalitions and consolidate their own power, right? So kind of concretely, when an elite is appointed to the defense minister position, they suddenly have control over the entire military, right? Which is a very meaningful way to kind of empower that specific elite. So similarly, one of the things that I find is that not all constitutional rules are kind of equally powerful or equally effective. It's constitutional rules that really kind of empower elites, right? So for instance, when the vice president is designated as the de facto successor, that's a rule that kind of really has bite and kind of meaningfully constrains presidential power. The second really big finding of my book is that the first few years that a leader enters power is actually really crucial in shaping what these institutional decisions look like. So specifically, I find that when leaders enter power initially weak, these are the guys that end up having to kind of extend an olive branch to other elites and offer them these power sharing opportunities in order to maintain support of these elites. On the other hand, leaders that enter power already incredibly strong basically don't need to make any concessions to other elites. They basically are not at risk of being deposed. So concretely, these are, for instance, kind of post-independence founding father leaders who were really kind of active in kind of the independence movements of their country. They come into power extremely strong and basically don't need to rule jointly with other elites, right? But there's kind of a real path dependency to these initial decisions, because these initial institutional decisions that leaders make when they first come to power end up really shaping the trajectory of the regime. So regimes that have a lot of these power sharing mechanisms in place end up surviving much longer in the long run. And in fact, these regimes are more able to survive multiple leadership transitions. On the other hand, initially strong leaders may be secure for the time that they're in office, but personalist regimes end up tending to die with these founding leaders. And so in the long run, they actually end up being incredibly unstable. So those are kind of the main takeaways of my book. So why don't I hand it over to Bryn now, and she'll give a quick summary of her main findings.
Great. Thanks so much, Annie. Let's see, let me share my screen here. Hopefully you can all see that now. All right. So Annie, thank you so much for the invitation, and to the Miller Center and the Democratic Statecraft Lab at UVA for hosting us. It's really a delight to be here. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and so fun to share this panel with the terrific work that Annie's done and Liz. So what you're looking at here is the cover of my book, The Autocratic Middle Class, and the image on the cover is of a pro-Putin rally. The flags that the people are holding here say "Strong Russia, Strong President." And among the motivations for writing this book was the fact that despite very fast-paced growth of Russia's middle class throughout the 2000s, as we know, Russia's political system was becoming more and not less autocratic over that same period. And from the perspective of a long line of thinking in political science, this was really puzzling. The quotes here represent half a century of scholarship on democratization, all of which has expected the middle class to be a force for democracy. And you could go all the way back to Aristotle in tracing this idea. If you look at the last quote, right, especially as mobilized transitions, right, as large-scale civic protests have become increasingly common means to transition to democracy, the role of the middle class, has been thought to be incredibly important. Yet, if we look, if we look at the middle class, the role of the middle class across different countries, in time periods, we see that the role of the middle class has really varied historically. And this variation remains largely unexplained, making this book one of the very first comparative studies to examine kind of concrete preferences and interests of the middle class using public opinion data. And this is increasingly possible. Whereas just a few years ago, we didn't really have much evidence by way of public opinion from non-democratic settings. Okay, so the book begins with the observation that authoritarians around the world think strategically about the preferences and interests of their middle classes. So to give you just one example, here is the Kremlin strategy 2020. This was a set of strategic development goals that were put forward by the Kremlin back around the time that I started thinking about this book. And circled here in red, just below increasing per capita GDP, increasing the annual growth rate, and ahead of raising export volumes, is a goal for the Kremlin's development paradigm was increasing the size of the middle class to greater than 50% of the population. So then it's important to note that the segment of the middle class that has grown most rapidly and fared best in Russia, even as the Russian economy has slowed, has been public sector managers and professionals who are employed in the state administration, in state enterprises, and in other parts of the public sector. In other words, its state-dependent middle class is this segment of the middle class that's grown fastest and fared best. And Russia's not the only regime that's thinking strategically about its middle class. Well, I spent about a year in the former Soviet Union doing work on this project, and I was in Kazakhstan in Central Asia when the regime party, the dominant party under then President Nursultan Nazarbayev, adopted a new party platform. And as you see here, how did it describe the party's key task? Well, its key task, it says, is the formation of a strong middle class. A middle class that's able to serve as the basis for economic, social, and perhaps most importantly, political stability. Okay, so the question at the heart of this project that the book endeavors to shed some light on is whether these regimes, as they pursue development which increases the size of the middle class, sowing the seeds of autocracy's demise. And the book's answer is no, that regimes can shape middle class formation through state economic engagement, and that the resulting economic dependency of the middle class really benefits autocrats. Because the character of these state-supported middle classes, their preferences and interests differ importantly from what classical theory leads us to expect. They are less agents of democratization, as the conventional wisdom goes, and more a force for authoritarian stability. And so drawing on evidence from across the former Soviet Union, the book shows that, in fact, state dependency does limit middle class support for democracy. And it shows this using a variety of individual level public opinion data, so surveys of public opinion from across the former Soviet region, across former Soviet autocracies. And it also shows that this state dependency has a causal effect on political preferences. So that is to say, it's not simply the case that people who are less supportive of democracy tend to find themselves in these middle class positions of dependence on the state, but rather that economic dependence on the state itself actually makes the middle class more hesitant about democracy and democratization. And finally, the evidence in the book shows that state dependency importantly weakens democratic protest coalitions, that it undermines pro-democracy movements, making it harder for pro-democracy civic revolutions to achieve the kind of critical mass that's necessary to overthrow a regime, that's necessary to consolidate a strong and stable democracy. So just to conclude by kind of returning to the example of Russia that I gave just a moment ago, there are lots of puzzling aspects of Russian politics. One that I'd say is pretty fundamental. It's often said that Russia is too rich, too well educated to be so non-democratic. In other words, we have this expectation, and it's quite firmly entrenched, whether in scholarly literature or in sort of popular accounts. Just open the pages of The Economist magazine, that with development, we expect to see democratization. Okay, so this book helps to explain why it is that when the state plays a major role in the economy, support for democracy is often lacking, and authoritarianism is often quite resilient. So thanks very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Awesome, thanks so much. Liz, why don't you give us your book summary?
Great, thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Great, that's showing up as it should. Thank you so much to Annie, and to everyone at UVA for making today possible. It's obviously a very weird year and a half to have come out with a first book, so it's so exciting to be able to talk about my own work in conversation with these two really wonderful books. And I think Annie showed you the covers. I think they make a really nice set, so you should buy all three and put them on your bookshelf. So my book is titled After Repression, How Polarization Derails Democratic Transition. Now we're going to move from Russia to the Middle East and North Africa. This book started as essentially a puzzle trying to make sense of the Arab Spring uprisings, which happened about 10 years ago this year. In December 2010, the Arab Spring essentially started in Tunisia, in the interior of the country. Mohamed Bouazizi, who was a fruit vendor, self-immolated and inspired a wave of protests around the country. By January 2011, a long-ruling authoritarian resigned. He fled to Saudi Arabia, where he would later pass away. In Egypt, essentially, Egypt likes to think it is the center of the Arab world, the self-appointed center of the Arab world. And when the Arab Spring spread to Egypt, it was considered to be really a movement in a way that Tunisia didn't quite inspire. In January 2011, January 25th, a number of activists reclaimed what's called National Police Day. It normally is a commemoration of the role that the police have played in essentially, keeping the regime in place. This started off 18 days of protests that ended up with another long-term authoritarian regime essentially being destabilized. Hosni Mubarak retired to his villa on the Red Sea. So initially, these seemed like very similar transitions, right? So these are the first two countries where there were massive protests that start massive protests in other parts of the Arab world. In both cases, long-ruling authoritarian presidents resigned. So in Tunisia, Ben Ali had been in power since 1987. In Egypt, Hosni Mubarak had been in power since 1981. In some ways, this was unheard of, right? That these people would resign rather than being, dying in office. Another similarity was that the former opposition was now in charge of the transition, right? So the democratic opposition that contests elections in authoritarian regimes was, not the only player, but they were really important for making these important transitional decisions during those first couple of years. In both cases, we have the salience of the religious secular cleavage. As I'm sure the audience knows, the religious secular divide in the Middle East is somewhat unique. There's one end of the spectrum that focuses on the combination of religion and politics, and one that tries to really separate these things in both public life and politics. And then finally, in both cases, Islamists, the long-standing Islamist opposition groups, win 37% of these first elections. So again, a number of similarities that might make us think that these two transitions might go quite similarly. Well, if you've followed the news and the developments on the ground in these countries, that's absolutely not the case. So within 3 years, we see Tunisia, the one real democratic success story of the Arab Spring, on a very difficult path, but towards continued democratic consolidation, right? So in January 2014, after a number of fits and starts, the parliament passes a new constitution, which not only had concessions from both sides, but also agreement from both sides, right? Everybody buys into this constitution, and it undoes quite a bit of the undemocratic institutions and practices that had defined the Ben Ali regime. This paves the way for second elections. There's a presidential election that's held, as well as a parliamentary election later that year. And it paves the way for a peaceful transfer of power from an Islamist-led government to a secular-led government. During the same time period in Egypt, we see, almost the opposite outcome. The constitutional drafting process is fraught with polarization, a lot of tension between the Muslim Brotherhood dominated government and the opposition, the secularists. The Brotherhood essentially rams through a constitution that's quite conservative and quite, undemocratic. In December 2012, there's a referendum with very low turnout that approves this constitution. This heightens tensions. In July 2013, the Egyptian military steps in, performs a coup. And the current president, who may be in power through 2030, essentially comes to power in July 2014. Egypt is very much a case, in contrast to Tunisia, of authoritarian retrenchment. So in trying to make sense of this, first as a graduate student, and then in rewriting this from a dissertation to a book manuscript, I went back to the literature on the last wave of democratization, right? The third wave earlier in the early 1990s. And something that's really central to our understanding of transitions was that polarization is extremely important for when you get from a revolutionary situation, right, where a leader has been deposed, to a democratic transition. And as I'll show you in the book, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the talk, Egypt and Tunisia were differently polarized in 2011. So a lot of this rang true as being important for understanding why these two countries were, ending up in such different places only 3 years into the transition. But this literature in some ways was, a little bit frustrating to me. The first, limitation was that polarization wasn't always well defined. Thinking about the American context in the contemporary period, we often use polarization both to mean disagreement and dislike. And beyond that, there was really no discussion of where polarization came from under these authoritarian regimes. Quite a bit of this literature focuses on the process through which polarization emerges in democratic contexts. So the motivating question for this project became trying to understand, why do authoritarian political systems emerge more or less polarized during transitions? And as I mentioned before, I try to put together a definition of polarization that encompasses the phenomenon that we see on the ground in these countries. So both affect, right, the extent to which these groups dislike each other, and preference polarization, the extent to which these groups disagree. In the story that I'm telling here, these things work together, but future research might try to disentangle which one really is doing the work of derailing this democratic transition in Egypt and seems to keep it on track in Tunisia. So my answer, in a very theoretical sense, is that repression conditions political polarization through a two-step process. So in the first step, repression conditions identity, political identity, and then political identity through political psychological processes of group differentiation condition the level of political polarization, both in terms of affect and preference polarization. So let me break this down a little bit further. So repression here creates or updates political identity through three reinforcing mechanisms. The most important one in my argument is the psychological mechanism. So repression reveals some kind of information to the opposition about who else is in the in-group, right? Is it just the one group, in the case of Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, who's being repressed? Or in the case of Tunisia, is it the entire opposition? And this in turn either heightens in-group identification for the targeted repressive environment like Egypt, or it bridges and creates new super identities that create lower levels of polarization. The way that I go about doing this is starting at the beginning. So the first question, before we even get to the effects of repression, is why do regimes repress differently? So I start in the Middle East. This is not to say that colonial experience is the be-all end-all of what these states look like later, but in terms of state building and in terms of police and coercive institutions, the institutions that do the work of repressing in the later independent authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, this is a really influential time. So I start by looking at where coercion, intelligence gathering, and policing comes from in these cases. Next, I look at how repression differs in these two different cases. So I document that in Tunisia, there is a widespread repressive regime. All groups are being targeted at one point or another, and it creates a very similar experience of repression for these groups. In turn, that increases kind of an oppositional identity that leads to less levels of political polarization. In Egypt, this is a targeted repressive regime. Under the Mubarak regime, there's very much a focus on repressing the Muslim Brotherhood at very regular intervals. As a result, I document how the in-group identity of the Muslim Brotherhood becomes very strong with detrimental effects on its ability to cooperate and compromise with other groups. The last part of the book kind of brings us back to where I started my brief remarks, looking at how democratic transitions might be affected by polarization. I look at how polarization, both affective and preference polarization, essentially explains the difference between Egypt and Tunisia on three different dimensions. So first, drafting and passing that constitution that I mentioned, scheduling and holding first elections, and finally, whether or not there is any kind of meaningful transitional justice campaign in terms of holding account the old regime. So my last slide here is thinking through what I'm hoping are the contributions of the book and why I hope you'll pick it up and take a look. One thing I try very hard to do is rethink repression. Quite a bit of the political science literature on repression tends to think of it as this rational constraint. It makes certain behaviors more costly, other behaviors less costly, and in that way shapes political behavior. What I'm thinking about repression as is, a very traumatic, both physically and psychologically, this kind of experience that is absolutely the stuff of identity formation. And so it's very much through this lived experience rather than a structural constraint that repression may be conditioning democratic outcomes down the road. Second, the contingency idea is one that has been around for a long time. I think we see it every day mattering for when we get democracies who stay on track and when we get ones that go off track, right? There's always important decisions to be made at important key moments. And what I'm trying to do here is bring in some of the political psychology of that, the micro foundations of why certain leaders are able to, work together, compromise, cooperate during these moments of high impact for democratic outcomes. And then finally, this is perhaps more of an academic gripe than a policy gripe, but political psychology tends to focus on what's called weird context. So Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic contexts. And I'm hoping that this will inspire more people to think about these generalizable processes outside of the West. So with that, I will turn it back over to Annie. Thank you so much again for this opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks so much. The first question that I would like to pose to kind of start our conversation is, what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions about democratization, dictatorship, regime transitions that your book sheds light on? So in other words, what are some of the biggest ideas that come out of your work that kind of put us on the cutting edge of research on these topics right now?
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Yeah, so one thing that I think is important is I think bringing in the political psychology of these very interesting, potentially very flawed human beings that are charged with making these huge decisions at moments that mean so much, right? Whether we get a democracy or an autocracy. I think it's potentially, I hope it's cutting edge, to think about what are the experiences that people have had that they bring into these situations, right? They're not starting from scratch. Many of these, in both of my cases, it's men, these men had relationships. They had either suffered together or they hadn't. And when I was doing my fieldwork, that became increasingly evident that that was a really important component of democratization that I didn't quite see addressed in the literature.
Yeah, and I think what I really love about your book is it really emphasizes just how hard democratization is, right? It's much more common for us to go from an autocracy to another autocracy when there is some kind of uprising, or if there is some kind of movement, or when there's protest, right? And there's basically only one case that emerged as a democracy out of the Arab Spring. And it's so much more common that we get, like a uprising or some kind of unrest. And really, you just get another autocracy. And in fact, in a lot of cases in sub-Saharan Africa, there were even cases where the opposition party came into power and everyone was really excited, but then the opposition party ended up being very authoritarian as well, right? We saw this happen in Zambia. So yeah, I really like that point gets like super emphasized in your book.
I think I'm not going to even try with these statistics, but Killian Clark, who's about to start as an assistant professor at Georgetown University, has coined this term called counterrevolution. He might not be the first one to do it, but he's, expanding it as something that we can all use. And the numbers are staggering, right? So of, the hundreds of revolutionary situations we see over the course of decades, we end up with very, very few successful revolutions. And even, as you're saying, revolutions where you have the opposition party or a civilian party in power, more likely than not are going to be overturned. And so I think, often people point to Tunisia as being somehow more secular or less influenced by, the West or by Europe. And some of those things are somewhat true, but the repressive situation in Tunisia, which was somewhat as a function of being so repressive, was a bit outside of what scholars could observe before 2011. It was extremely foundational for what has come since. It's like perhaps the only silver lining of a widespread repressive regime, that it puts in place certain conditions that can help democratization down the road.
Yeah, it's almost like a reversal of fortune type of trajectory, right?
Yeah.
No, I mean, continuing on this theme of being, I guess, a little bit pessimistic about democratization, Bryn, I mean, I found your kind of main finding of just how like normal middle-class people aren't necessarily democratic, revolutionaries to be hugely compelling, right? And it really does go against a lot of political science research that's kind of considered classic.
Yeah, I can pick up on a couple of themes that you've been talking about. I mean, authoritarianism has been surprisingly resilient. And we have lots and lots of these moments that have been read as democratic breakthroughs. I mean, from the perspective of, a scholar of post-communism, look at the trajectories of many of the countries that have experienced color revolutions. Lots of these democratic breakthroughs have led to regime cycling. They've led to the replacement of one non-democratic regime with another. And I think, one contribution in the book is to help us, understand why, counter some of the conventional wisdom that you're mentioning, Annie, because the book explores how these key segments of middle class in these regimes are aligned with autocracy because their well-being depends on it, because they lack alternatives outside of the state sector, because they depend on perks and privileges that they face losing if a country democratizes. Right? So it suggests, that authoritarian regimes can survive not in spite of, as we often sort of the conventional wisdom holds, but because of a middle class that's educated and professional, right? And that group is also often hesitant about democratization. And that's the case if we think about Russia, we think about Venezuela, Singapore, Iran. It's an argument that travels well to a lot of cases, even outside the post-communist region.
And I think that like a misconception people often have about everyday people living under autocracy is that, they're sitting around thinking about how they live in a dictatorship and how they can like democratize the country, right? But that's just not what life under a dictatorship looks like for most people, right? And Tom Popinski had a great Vox article on this recently that I really liked, where, he stressed, and I think that a lot of us who work on autocracies, this gets echoed in our work. Life under autocracy can feel very ordinary, right? For most people, not necessarily for the kind of small group of activists, or maybe if you're kind of like some kind of, minority group that's getting repressed, then life can feel very different. But for a lot of people living under dictatorship, they wake up, they go to work, right? Like they have families, they have friends, they have a job. And for the most part, the state kind of like stays out of the way, right? And they're not thinking about regime change or democratization, and they're just kind of like living, right? And so I think that I really like that your book kind of like reinforces the fact that there is a sense of ordinary in these states. And in fact, autocratic regimes that are smart about it kind of like reinforce the ordinary and kind of provide economic opportunities for the ordinary, right?
Yeah. There's one other thing that came up towards the end of Liz's talk about her book, and that of what you're saying, Annie, is picking up on, is that the contingency in democratization, right? That we have a lot of there are a lot of stories, and particularly sort of popular accounts of how democratization works or what autocratic regimes are like, that lack nuance. The one that you were just talking about, Annie. Another one I'd say in this case is this sort of breathless expectations about development leading to democracy, right? That it was development in the Middle East that produced the Arab Spring movements, that it was development and fast-paced economic growth in the former Soviet Union that led to color revolutions, that development leads to democracy and a rising middle class demanding democracy. And there's this kind of distinctly deterministic streak in these kinds of arguments, right? But popular demands for democracy, and particularly those from the middle class, are much more contingent. And they depend on these things like the structure of the economy, how economic growth is achieved. So, I think these studies shed light on, if we believe that democracy requires democrats, what kinds of places we're likely to see real sort of popular support for democratization. And one insight from my book is that democratization faces real obstacles in a society where the state is extensively involved in the economy.
Yeah, and I think kind of along this theme of kind of just how hard it is to democratize, one of the big ideas that comes out in my book that I think really goes against how we think about the kind of end of the Cold War and the so-called third wave of democratization was that, when the Cold War ended in the 1990s, a lot of former authoritarian regimes started holding multi-party elections, right? They adopted the language of democracies. They had legislatures. They allowed opposition parties to kind of participate. And we all kind of threw our hands up and we were like, we did it. There's this like third wave of democratization. Like we're seeing the emergence of democracies. We're done. Right. And so one of the really big ideas that my book does is to really challenge that narrative. Right. And I argue that really what we saw in the 1990s, when these kind of, post-war autocracies started adopting all of these institutions, was we saw the rise of durable authoritarianism. Right. We did not see real democratization happen because in a lot of these cases, even though these autocratic leaders and their ruling parties adopted a lot of these institutions, they managed to stay in power, right? So kind of seeming democratic on the face does not necessarily ensure that you get kind of real turnover and real democratization, right? And in fact, I think one of the kind of big findings of my book, as well as a lot of other recent research on autocracies, is that kind of constrained dictatorship is durable dictatorship. And it looks kind of startlingly similar to kind of democracies on the surface nowadays. And so I argue that we really kind of misinterpreted what was going on in the kind of 1990s when a lot of these regimes started to kind of seemingly liberalize. And so I think that really kind of draws the literature on autocracies with democracies together, and that it's really kind of blended together. And there's a lot more continuation from the autocratic past now as we kind of previously thought, right? There wasn't just this kind of clean break from some authoritarian past to like a democratic future, right? There's actually been a lot of continuity.
I think that's an incredibly important point, that democratization is never a clean break from a country's past. And Liz's study speaks beautifully to this, that a country as it democratizes brings its past with it and the constraints that lie therein. Whether a democratic breakthrough is achieved through popular protest or elite initiative, they're difficult to consolidate. It's difficult to translate into a successful, stable democracy. So in the political economy perspective of my book, it's when a large part of the middle class is dependent for its well-being on an authoritarian regime. And taking up the case of Ukraine, a country that struggled to consolidate democracy after the opening that was created by the 2004 Orange Revolution, we can see some of these dynamics at play. Lots of reasons for this, but a weakly reformed public sector, its expansive role in the country's economy, right? Ukraine brings all of this with it. It's not a clean break, as Annie was saying, into its efforts to consolidate democracy.
Yeah, and maybe just to jump on with the Middle East perspective, I think what's interesting about what Annie just said is, the democratization. I think the term that Middle East scholars often called it was liberalization without democratization, right? So you got things like parliaments, you got elections, especially in the 1990s, as the US became, the global hegemon, pushing a certain kind of democratic narrative and certain kinds of foreign aid, right? But those things didn't meaningfully, sure, I'm sure they contributed in some way, right? All of these big processes are not monocausal. The Arab Spring wasn't just the result of, one fellow setting himself on fire. Also, inequality had been really important, all these different things. But I think the way that a lot of people had initially thought about this was that the level of contestation within these, controlled, constrained spaces was somehow going to be important for the democratic outcomes that we saw. But in fact, Tunisia had very little democratic contestation within its electoral space, permitted by the regime. So it's interesting to think about, what role these things are playing and why they're important down the road, right? In my book, one thing that I talk about is the importance of having this space available and visible, right? So to know that you're being repressed, you have to be able to see that there are people who are not being repressed, right? Or to see, okay, we're all being repressed. So I think these institutions can serve really interesting and kind of counterintuitive roles, right, in whether or not you get democratization. And just one comment on Bryn's book as well. Tunisia is a case as well where, and Egypt, in both cases, those who have been employed by the state tend to be the least democratic in kind of the way that we would assume. It's very, very much resonates with what you've talked about.
Awesome. So what we're going to do now is I got a lot of very similar questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to kind of lump a bunch of questions together. We got a ton of questions about thinking about our studies in the context of US politics. So why don't we kind of address that right now, right? Like, how do you see your own books as kind of, can you extend part of your argument to thinking about the US? So Bryn, you got some questions about kind of thinking about state dependence or thinking about kind of, economic voters. Liz, polarization is obviously kind of like a huge word that's been thrown around a lot in US politics. And I'll speak a little bit in terms of kind of whether the US is in danger of democratic erosion, which is also just like a huge topic right now.
Yeah, so I think there's one theme that sort of resonates in the US context, which is that what sets the cases that I'm considering in this book, these post-communist autocracies, sort of apart from the way that we have thought about sort of the role of the public sector in the US, is the autonomy and independence from political meddling of our public sector. Okay, so efforts to erode those protections, right, that we have merit-based recruitment and promotion into the civil service, right, that we cannot use our public sector employees as they are often used in autocratic settings to mobilize and get out the vote, that we can't use them to help fraudulently, count and doctor the vote, that we don't use public sector institutions as campaign headquarters for political parties, right? These are important boundaries between against sort of politicization of the public sector. And there have been efforts over recent years to erode those. I think the book suggests that those are really concerning trends. But that said, there are important differences between these two settings. Corruption, typically endemic, the public sector, very expansive, actually crowding out sort of alternative livelihoods in the private sector. So important differences between these two settings as well, and it should stay that way.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think there are probably two ways that, or two areas in which, maybe the audience can think about what my argument might mean for recent developments in the United States. So the first one that I've thought quite a bit about over the last, year and a half is the institutional design of some of our repressive institutions, which are, even in a democracy, we have repression, right? We have police, we have intelligence institutions. I think there's two aspects of my book that might be worth exploring for other scholars and for practitioners. The first being, is this system functioning by design, right? Was it designed as what we might term a targeted repressive institution that goes after certain kinds of people? I am not an expert on this, but my understanding of the development of policing in the United States is that it is very much tied to, the original sin of slavery. And so thinking through who gets targeted by the repressive state in the United States and what that might mean in terms of its implications, right, in creating certain kinds of polarized narratives, polarized identities. Those are the two aspects, right? So is this a system that's functioning by design, and was it designed as a targeted repressive environment? And then what are the implications for that, right, politically? I guess the second thing that more recently has come to mind is, the contingency argument is not just for moments of high consequence during, democratization. I think in the last, 5 months, we've seen moments where politicians making very difficult decisions and very difficult compromises matters for keeping a democratic system on track, right? So I think there's something to be said about, continuing to think about when contingency matters. It's not just, right, at these big moments of change. It does seem to matter on almost a daily basis, and around big events, right? Like I'm thinking of the insurrection at the Capitol, where making certain decisions about holding people accountable, tampering down on polarized rhetoric, these things really matter for the future of a democracy, and not just when it's a question between autocracy and democracy. There are shades of meaning in these moments that need to be prioritized.
Yeah, I picking up on just this theme of it's not just black and white categories of autocracy versus democracy. This always really permeates my answer to this question. As I get this question, as someone who studies dictatorships, I always get, or at least starting from 2016 onward, I have gotten many versions of this freaked out question of like, are we going to become an autocracy? And I think that my perspective is actually flipped, interestingly. Something I tell my students all the time is that the US started out as an autocracy, right? This myth that we were founded as some ideal democracy is just not true, right? Even if you just go by the most minimalist procedural definition of a democracy, which is that you have electoral competition and people can vote. When we were founded, very few people could vote. Right? Women couldn't vote until 1920. Black people were effectively disenfranchised until the 1960s. So we have really only been a democracy for 50 years, since 1966, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, right? And even today, there's a lot of efforts to stop people from voting, right? So at best, we're still like a problematic democracy, right? And so I often find it really helpful to flip that question on its head and really challenge our conception of ourselves as a democracy from the start, right? We have very autocratic bones, actually. And I would argue that a lot of the conflict that we're seeing now in the past couple of years is actually, interestingly, I would argue, a result of kind of increased democratization, right? More people can vote now than before. And also more people, more different types of people are kind of gaining access in representation, right? And, our kind of political elites are becoming more diverse. And so in this process of actually becoming more democratized, we're getting really violent pushback from kind of, the old guard who used to have a lot more control over the process, right? The US was actually, we weren't, if we just want to think about executive constraints, which are the types of institutions that I focus on, executive constraints in the US are actually a fairly new phenomena. For instance, we didn't get term limits in the Constitution until the 1950s, right? So, I mean, even just looking at the kind of most basic types of constitutional rules, I think you would actually be surprised at kind of like what a recent development this was in the US. The other thing that I've looked at in my newer work is whether we really are seeing this kind of global erosion of, constraints on presidential power. And what I find when I look at executive constraints, so constitutional rules, term limits, these kind of key cabinet positions, I'm not actually seeing a sharp decline in the presence of these kind of executive constraints, which really kind of goes against this narrative that we're seeing this like global increase in authoritarianism. It's totally possible that kind of certain types of things are happening that I'm not focusing on. Maybe there's more media censorship or kind of other elements of it. But in terms of just looking at kind of executive constraints, I'm not actually seeing a sharp decline. And so I think it's really important that we kind of look systematically at the data when we're trying to think about whether we're seeing democratic erosion, both at home at the US as well as abroad. Okay, so we have about 4 minutes left. So I just figured I maybe would kind of open it up to the two of you in case you have any kind of last minute thoughts or, what are you kind of working on next and where is the research going next?
I'm happy to start. Yeah, so there's a lot of exciting work. For me now, the most exciting work focuses on how citizens think and behave under autocracy and during democratization. I think there's this real growing recognition that citizens in authoritarian regimes aren't passive vessels of regime propaganda, that their attitudes and beliefs can actually constrain autocratic leaders. This is so counter to the way that we used to think about, mass publics under autocracy for many, many years. Overwhelmingly in our field, research on autocracy and democratization for the last decade has been kind of cross-national, which is to say, kind of comparing the experiences of a large number of different countries. But some of the most exciting frontiers have to do with understanding individual motivations and psychological factors. So to give you two quick examples of areas that I think are really interesting. One, we still don't understand very well how public support for autocratic regimes unravels during crises. Right? So I have a co-author, Graham Robertson, and a colleague, Sam Green, who've written on the importance of personality traits like agreeableness for autocratic regime support. But there's an interesting, outstanding question about whether these sort of agreeables, these agreeable authoritarians, could also be the key to understanding why public support for regimes often seems to evaporate overnight. Right. So, for example, after surprisingly weak electoral performance, right? How do these popular coalitions supporting autocrats unravel? Could agreeable authoritarian regime support, change rapidly? How they try to maintain a positive relationship with others? These sorts of studies, could help us understand roots of kind of cascade-like dynamics that of defection that often bring down authoritarian regimes. So that's one. The other one, we're short on time. Very briefly, is the risk tolerance, understanding that political participation in autocratic systems involves risks, but we know so little about where attitudes towards risk come from, what they are, how they change, and how they're subject to framing by the regime and the opposition. So that's, I think, where my next book project is headed.
Yeah, really quickly, the book, my first book, essentially stops mostly in 2014, but then very much cuts off in 2018. All of my new projects are looking at what comes after the Arab Spring. This was a monumentous experience for everyone who lived through it, right? Even if it didn't result in democratization. So I've started to look at, exposure to violence during the revolutions and its effect on mental health and drug use in places like Egypt. And the next book project is going to be focused on, Egypt has become extremely repressive in the last 7-8 years. And there's a huge Arab population, both from Egypt and elsewhere, notably Syria, right, where the Arab Spring created a huge humanitarian disaster in the way that the Syrian regime responded to it. So I'm looking at the role of Arab activists in exile in places like Berlin, Istanbul, New York, and how they're continuing to mobilize and what they make of this experience 10 years ago. Because I think, whatever the Arab Spring was, it's probably not over yet.
Yeah, these things are rarely ever just over in an instant, and often kind of are, continue to be trajectories for the regime. Well, awesome. I can't wait to see all of our second books, and maybe we can have this panel again in a few years. So that is it for our panel. On behalf of the Miller Center and the Statecraft Lab, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thanks so much, Bryn and Liz, for doing this awesome conversation with me. It was super interesting, and I learned a lot. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annie.